Hey guys, tonight, we're traveling back to a time when the sound of crickets outside a stone window, the flickering of candlelight, and the smell of fresh herbs mingled with something more ancient than sleep itself. Insomnia. That's right. We're heading to the Middle Ages, where even the holy nuns of the time had a hard time catching some zias just like you might after one too many episodes of whatever your latest binge watch is. But here's the kicker: while you're tossing and turning, worrying about tomorrow's to-do list, these nuns had a rather unique way of making sure their minds stayed blissfully calm and their dreams sweet. You probably won't survive this one either. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the time of day you're watching from in the comments below. I always love knowing where people are tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture it a small stone cloister tucked away in the hills, maybe somewhere in France or Germany. The air is cool, the evening is creeping in, and all around the sounds of the abbey are quieting down. The sisters of this particular order are finishing their evening chores and preparing for one of the few moments in their day when peace might actually settle in bedtime. Or at least, that's what it should be. The trouble is, like many of us medieval nuns often had trouble falling asleep, but they weren't just tossing and turning, staring at the stone ceiling. Like the rest of us, they had a secret weapon. Now don't get too comfortable in your bed, because before we dive into the juicy details of medieval sleep aids, let's look at the life of these nuns. Their days were regimented, very regimented, rising before dawn to sing prayers, followed by hours of chanting, sewing, and other monastic duties. The idea of quiet, peaceful sleep after such a full day should have been a given right. Well, not exactly. In fact, it's said that in the medieval world, sleep was something to be earned not merely the natural state of a person. These nuns lived a lifestyle where productivity was often prized over rest, and it wasn't uncommon for many to experience troubled sleep, especially with all the mental and physical strain. So in their infinite wisdom, they found a rather creative way to cope. Instead of counting sheep or tossing back a few warm mugs of milk, nuns in many monastic communities turned to a method as old as time itself: herbal remedies. These were no ordinary herbs. We're talking about finely crafted, sometimes oddly concocted mixtures, some designed specifically to calm the mind, settle the stomach, and yes, help induce a nice, deep sleep. And as you can imagine, not all remedies were safe or tasty. But hey, they worked. The nuns believed that sleep, just like everything else in their lives, could be guided through divine intervention, whether that was through prayer, fasting, or you guessed it, drinking certain herbal infusions that had been thoughtfully prepared in their abbey kitchens. Historians still argue whether these herbal remedies were really as effective as the nuns claimed, or if they were simply a placebo that helped create a more peaceful environment. Whatever the case, there's no doubt that these methods worked for many. The real question is what was in the concoctions they were drinking. Well, we're about to find out. Now that you've got a little taste of medieval monastic life, let's dive deeper into the nitty-gritty of their daily routine, and how that routine had some not-so-cushy side effects, like, say, insomnia. You might think that nuns living a life devoted to quiet prayer and contemplation would have no trouble slipping into a peaceful slumber. But sleep wasn't always as simple as closing your eyes and letting go. Far from it. Imagine the scene. It's an early morning in the abbey just before dawn. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and earth, and all around you, the abbey is waking up. The nuns rise at an ungodly hour to prepare for lauds, the first prayer of the day. They aren't rolling out of bed like you might on a lazy Saturday morning. Instead, they're up before the sun and ready to spend hours singing psalms, praying, and performing chores all before breakfast. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. By the time evening comes around, their bodies are exhausted, but their minds, well, not so much. You see, despite the physical toll, nuns didn't exactly enjoy the luxury of winding down with a good book or a calming meditation session. No, instead, their leisure time, which was hardly ever truly leisurely, was often spent in contemplation prayer, and sometimes even writing religious texts. Their days were packed, and with that came the inevitable difficulty of winding down. They may have prayed for rest, but that didn't always mean they'd get it. Historians still argue whether the constant schedule of prayer and work caused the nuns' insomnia, or if the stress of their spiritual obligations created the sleep disturbances. Regardless of the cause, the problem of poor sleep was real. And that's where the herbal remedies came in. But before we jump into their sleep potions, let's take a moment to think about what made sleep so tricky for these women. It wasn't just the work or the prayers, it was the spiritual aspect of their lives. You see, for medieval nuns, sleep wasn't just about shutting down their brains and getting rest. It was about staying in a constant state of spiritual readiness, the fear of not being prepared for the next prayer or chant, or not being in the right state of mind for spiritual communion, meant that their minds were often on high alert, even when their bodies were begging for rest. So in their effort to remain spiritually vigilant and physically rested, they developed creative, and at times experimental ways of helping themselves fall asleep. It's easy to imagine how something like insomnia could have been a serious issue when every hour of your day had a divine purpose. Nuns weren't just looking for sleep as a break from work. They were looking for a way to achieve a balance between the demands of their faith and the need for restorative rest. And so, with no access to the sleeping pills of today, they had to turn to what was readily available to them, the earth and its bounty. One of the key things nuns had at their disposal was the abbey's herb garden. These gardens were more than just a place for aesthetic flowers. They were medicinal hubs, teeming with plants that served a wide array of purposes. Herbs like lavender, chamomile, and valerian were grown not just for culinary use, but also for their healing properties. These plants were infused into oils, teas, and even wines, all designed to help calm the nerves and ease the mind after a long day. And of course, they didn't just rely on any old mixture. Nuns were incredibly meticulous, using knowledge passed down from ancient texts to craft their remedies. Historians still argue whether the nuns' knowledge of herbs was learned from Greek and Roman traditions, or if it was a wholly medieval innovation. The reality is probably a little of both. The ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocrates, were famous for their use of medicinal herbs, and many of those teachings found their way into the medieval monasteries. By the time of the Middle Ages, herbal knowledge was something of a sacred art, one that nuns not only used for physical health, but also as a way of connecting with the divine. But despite all these natural remedies, the real star of the show was something that might surprise you: wine. Yes, wine. But not just any wine. This was medicinal wine, a concoction of herbs steeped in alcohol that was used to treat all kinds of ailments from insomnia to indigestion. It was a potent blend of flavors, often spiced with ingredients like cinnamon cloves and ginger, and was believed to have both physical and spiritual benefits. This wasn't just for relaxation, it was part of the sacred routine, a tool that helped nuns maintain their mental clarity while ensuring their bodies didn't break down from the exhaustion of their lifestyle. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of wine in these sleep remedies was purely for medicinal purposes, or if it was also part of the nuns' spiritual practices. After all, alcohol has long been considered a conduit to a deeper connection with the divine in many religious traditions. Either way, these herbal wines were crucial in helping the nuns of the Middle Ages find their way to sleep after a long, spiritually demanding day. As we continue our journey into the medieval world of herbal sleep aids, let's take a closer look at the key ingredients nuns used in their nightly preparations for rest. It wasn't all about mixing a few leaves into a cup of water and calling it a day. Oh no, these nuns were serious about their sleep crafting, blending, and brewing specific herbs with incredible precision to make sure their sleep wasn't just deep, but restorative. But what were the ingredients of this secret potion? First up, we have a powerhouse herb known to modern-day insomnia sufferers, valerian root. If you've ever wandered down the herbal aisle at a health store, you've probably seen valerian sold as a sleep aid, and there's a reason for that. Valerian, a plant native to Europe and Asia, has been used for centuries to treat anxiety and insomnia. In the Middle Ages, nuns would have been familiar with its calming effects, using the root to help soothe the nervous system and ease the mental chatter that kept them awake at night. Some even believed that valerian helped calm the soul, providing a gentle connection between the body and the divine as they drifted into sleep. But valerian wasn't the only herb the nuns relied on. Chamomile was another go-to. Known for its sweet, gentle fragrance and calming properties, chamomile would have been brewed into a tea, steeped into an oil, or perhaps even infused into their nightly wine. With its anti-inflammatory and anti-anxiety properties, chamomile was the perfect ingredient for calming a restless mind and ensuring a peaceful night's sleep. Historians still argue whether chamomile's popularity was based on its practical medicinal effects or if it was just a comforting ritual passed down through generations. But one thing is certain: it was a familiar, soothing presence in the nuns' sleep routines. And then there's lavender. The ever-popular lavender. This lovely purple flower wasn't just a decoration in the abbey gardens. Nuns used it to calm anxiety, ease headaches, and promote deep, restful sleep. It was often placed under pillows or sewn into sachets, allowing the fragrance to subtly fill the air as they drifted off. The soothing scent of lavender has been found to lower heart rates and reduce blood pressure, making it a perfect natural sedative for anyone not just medieval nuns. The idea was to create a serene atmosphere, a moment of peace that would allow their bodies to relax enough to enter a state of sleep without the stress of their spiritual responsibilities looming over them. As soothing as lavender and valerian were, the nuns were always looking for more potent ways to make sure they could sleep well enough to continue their demanding spiritual work. Which brings us to an herb that probably sounds a bit more intense: mugwort. Mugwort was another key ingredient in many of their sleep remedies, and its reputation isn't for the faint of heart. Used in various forms from teas to tinctures to poultices, Mugwort was believed to promote vivid dreams and deep sleep, but it was also considered somewhat potent. Some nuns may have used it sparingly, as its effects were known to border on the hallucinatory, if consumed in large doses. In fact, mugwort has long been associated with heightened dreams, visions, and even lucid dreaming, a side effect that might have been both desirable and dangerous, depending on the nun's intentions. Historians still argue whether the use of mugwort was widespread among the nuns, or if it was reserved for more serious sleep disturbances. While its hallucinogenic properties were likely recognized, it's unclear whether the nuns used it for spiritual purposes, such as inducing visions, or merely as a powerful sleep aid. But sleep was not just about herbs. Oh no, it also involved some ritualistic practices that nuns believed helped them sink into slumber. Before bedtime, nuns would often engage in quiet prayer, meditative reflection, or even chanting, which helped center their minds. This wasn't just a way to relax, it was a necessary part of their spiritual lives. A peaceful, restful sleep was thought to bring them closer to God, and any interruptions to their rest were seen as a disturbance to their spiritual journey. And let's not forget the importance of the environment. Nuns were keenly aware that sleep wasn't just about what went into their bodies, but about the atmosphere around them. The abbey rooms were designed to be quiet, clean, and dimly lit, with thick stone walls that kept out much of the night's chill and noise. Candles flickered, casting soft shadows, while the scent of herbs both from the garden and from their concoctions lingered in the air. The idea was to create a sanctuary for sleep, a retreat from the overwhelming spiritual demands of the day. But that sanctuary didn't always work. Nuns like us sometimes found themselves tossing and turning, unable to quiet their restless minds. For these sleepless nights, the nuns turned to another sleep aid that we'll explore in the next section wine. Now, before you start imagining a glass of Chardonnay on a quiet evening, think again. This was medicinal wine, spiced and infused with herbs, to induce the kind of rest they desperately needed. It wasn't just a drink, it was a tool in their quest for spiritual and physical rest. Historians still argue whether the nuns used these herbal wines simply for sleep, or whether they were also a form of sacrament, a way of honoring God's gifts of nature. Either way, these elixirs were deeply woven into the fabric of monastic life. So what was in these wines, and how did they work? That's what we'll get into next. Now, as promised, let's talk about the other key element in the nuns' pursuit of sleep wine. But hold on a second. Don't start picturing a relaxing glass of your favorite Merlot by the fire. The wine medieval nuns drank wasn't for leisure, nor was it the kind of wine you'd casually sip at a dinner party. No, this was medicinal wine, crafted with purpose, precision, and some truly interesting ingredients. In the Middle Ages, wine was already a staple in daily life, even for people of the cloth. It wasn't just a beverage. It was a tool for health, faith, and even survival. But for the nuns, it wasn't enough to simply drink the wine for its alcohol content. Instead, the wine was turned into a complex brew, infused with herbs, spices, and other plant-based remedies to enhance its healing properties. This wasn't just about getting a little tipsy after a long day of prayers and work, though that was certainly a side effect. It was about finding peace and rest through the natural world. One of the most well-known herbal wines made by the nuns was called Hippocras, a sweet, spiced wine that served as both a digestive aid and a sleep aid. Hippocras wasn't just any wine mixed with some random herbs. It was a carefully crafted recipe that combined wine with ingredients like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes even saffron. The spices in the hippocras weren't just for flavor. They were believed to have medicinal benefits, with the warmth and richness of the spices working together to calm the mind and body. In essence, it was a pre-bedtime elixir designed to soothe the nervous system, ease the body into a more relaxed state, and encourage sleep. Historians still argue whether hippocras was originally developed as a purely medicinal drink, or if it was simply an attempt to create a wine that was more palatable for the religious masses. After all, medieval wines could be pretty rough. Regardless of its origins, hippocras became a staple in many monasteries and abbeys, and nuns often had their own secret recipes for making it. Some versions were stronger than others, and the herbs used could vary depending on the abbey or the nun's preferences. But the basic principle was always the same craft, a drink that could help induce relaxation and provide a peaceful transition into sleep. But let's not get carried away here. Hippocras wasn't the only kind of wine nuns used. There were other herbal wines that were specifically designed to help with sleep. Some of these were much simpler concoctions created by steeping herbs like valerian or chamomile directly into wine, allowing the flavors and properties of the plants to infuse the alcohol. The idea was that the alcohol in the wine helped the medicinal properties of the herbs to be absorbed more easily into the body, creating a powerful sleeping aid. Historians still argue whether the alcohol content in these herbal wines was enough to have a true sedative effect, or if the power of the herbs alone was what induced sleep. Some modern researchers believe that alcohol can have a disruptive effect on sleep patterns, causing people to fall asleep faster, but then wake up earlier and more restless later in the night. But medieval nuns may have had a different perspective on this. Perhaps for them, the combination of wine and herbs worked as a natural sedative, calming their minds after a long, demanding day. There's something particularly fascinating about how the nuns treated wine as a tool for both physical and spiritual wellness. The use of medicinal wine wasn't just about addressing insomnia. It was about integrating the body's needs with the soul's. Wine as a gift from God became an element of their holistic approach to health and well-being. In fact, many nuns viewed their herbal wines as a way to honor the divine connection between the natural world and the sacred. The herbs they used were considered to be God's gifts, and by crafting their wines, the nuns believed they were embracing the spiritual potential of nature in the most pure and sacred form. But not all herbal wines were designed for rest. Some were made to address other ailments like indigestion or even menstrual cramps, but the purpose behind all these remedies was the same: to restore balance to the body and mind. The key difference, though, was how these wines helped to create a sense of ritual around sleep, turning the process of winding down into a spiritual experience. And speaking of winding down, let's take a moment to reflect on how the nuns might have approached their bedtime routine. After a long day filled with prayer labor and herbal concoctions, the nuns would retire to their cells, small, modest rooms that were often shared by multiple women. The atmosphere of their sleeping quarters was as important as the wine they drank. The walls, thick and stone cold, kept out drafts, and the narrow windows allowed only small amounts of light to filter through, creating a dark, quiet environment that was ideal for sleep. Before heading to bed, the nuns would engage in a few final moments of prayer or quiet reflection. They understood that sleep wasn't just about resting the body, It was a spiritual practice in and of itself. In fact, many believed that the quality of sleep directly impacted their connection to God. It said that a good night's sleep was necessary to receive divine inspiration, just as a restful night was needed to fulfill the day's prayers with clarity and devotion. Historians still argue whether the nuns truly believed in the divine power of sleep, or if it was just part of the culture of piety that permeated every aspect of their lives. Whatever the case, it's clear that sleep was something they didn't take lightly. They approached it with reverence, using herbs, wine, and ritual to guide them into a deep, rejuvenating slumber that would prepare them for the day ahead. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at the dangers of some of these sleep remedies, because not all herbs were safe. Some had potential side effects that could leave the nuns in a state of, well, not quite sleep, but more on that soon. Now that we've explored how nuns used herbal remedies and wine to ease into sleep, let's dig into the more dangerous side of these sleep aids. Because as soothing as these concoctions might sound, not all of the herbs they used were as gentle as chamomile or valerian. Some of the more potent herbs carried significant risks, and the nuns, despite their deep spiritual knowledge, weren't always immune to the dangers of overindulgence or improper use. Take Dwale, for instance. This wasn't your average sleepy time tea. No, Dwale was a powerful, sometimes deadly potion, made from a variety of ingredients, including henbane, belladonna, and deadly nightshade, all of which are plants with a reputation for causing hallucinations, delirium, and in some cases death. But the nuns didn't see it that way. For them, Dwale was a sleep remedy, a solution for those who were struggling with severe insomnia or the restless mental states that followed the rigorous demands of monastic life. Historians still argue whether Dwale was used frequently or if it was only reserved for the most desperate cases. While we can't know for sure how often it was consumed, we do know that it was a dangerous brew. The plants used in Dwale were infamous for their toxic effects. Belladonna, for example, contains atropine, a compound that can cause dizziness, confusion, and even death in large doses. The idea behind Dwale was that the sedative effects of these herbs would help induce sleep, but the risk of poisoning was ever present. But there was more to this story than just poisoning. Some nuns and monks believed that the vivid dreams and hallucinations caused by Dwale were actually spiritual experiences, gifts from God that would reveal hidden truths or divine messages. The line between what was holy and what was dangerous became blurred in these instances. What might have been considered an otherworldly experience for one monk might have been a terrifying nightmare for another. Historians still argue whether Dwale was intended as a purely sleep aid or whether it was used as a form of spiritual or visionary exploration. Some suggest that it was considered a kind of sleeping potion to ease one into a restful state, while others believe it was specifically crafted to encourage deeper, more mystical experiences. Regardless of its intended purpose, though the risks were clear, and the potential consequences of a bad batch of Dwale were not something the nuns took lightly. While it was probably used sparingly, it's safe to say that the medieval fascination with the boundary between sleep and wakefulness was not always so well regulated. But let's not focus too much on the danger. After all, the nuns also had plenty of safer, more calming remedies at their disposal. For instance, while Dwale might have been reserved for extreme cases, there were other gentler preparations like herbal teas and tinctures, which were far more common. The the nuns would have likely used these milder preparations as part of their regular routine. After all, the goal was never to be knocked unconscious by their remedies, but to reach a state of calm that would ease them into a peaceful, restful sleep. One of the most common herbs used in these milder preparations was lavender. A simple and soothing herb, lavender was far less dangerous than belladonna, but its calming properties were still powerful. Nuns would often make lavender-infused oils, or simply place lavender sprigs under their pillows to ensure a tranquil night. The gentle scent of lavender, combined with its reputation for easing anxiety and promoting relaxation, made it a perfect remedy for a busy, stressed mind. Historians still argue about the extent to which nuns believed lavender's calming effects were natural or divinely inspired. Did they truly believe it was a gift from God, or was it simply a plant with calming properties that fit nicely into their routine? Some believe that, like other medicinal herbs, lavender was just part of the sacred duty to heal the body, mind, and soul. Others argue that the nuns' use of such herbs was deeply entwined with their spiritual lives, where every action from prayer to potion-making was seen as an opportunity to connect with the divine. Of course, we can't ignore the broader spiritual context in which these sleep aids were used. For medieval nuns, sleep wasn't just about physical rest. It was a sacred time, a chance for the body to rejuvenate and prepare for the next day of spiritual work. So even as they relied on herbs and potions to guide them into slumber, they would have still seen sleep as an important ritual. It wasn't a mere physical necessity. It was a moment of spiritual renewal. In fact, the very act of sleeping could be seen as a metaphor for spiritual death and rebirth. For many nuns, the ritual of going to bed was not just about shutting off the world. It was about surrendering to the divine will and allowing themselves to rest in the embrace of God's love. For them, a good night's sleep meant not only physical restoration, but spiritual rejuvenation, preparing them to meet the demands of another day in the service of God. But while most nuns might have relied on safer herbal remedies to help them sleep, the reality is that their path to peaceful rest wasn't always so straightforward. Even the best intentions could go awry, and some nuns, perhaps in search of a deeper connection with the divine, may have found themselves chasing dreams or nightmares that were darker and more dangerous than they ever intended. In the next section, we'll explore another facet of monastic life, the herb gardens that these nuns maintained, and how these gardens were not only a source of food, but also a place where the healing powers of nature were put to the test. As we delve deeper into the medieval world of herbal remedies, we can't ignore the critical role that the abbey herb gardens played in the lives of nuns, and particularly in their sleep rituals. These gardens were more than just places to grow herbs for culinary purposes. They were the nuns' pharmacy, their sanctuary, and sometimes their sanctuary from sleepless nights. The abbey gardens weren't just full of flowers for beauty or plants for food. They were carefully curated with medicinal plants that had been passed down through generations of monastic knowledge. Imagine yourself walking into one of these gardens in the cool, early morning light. The air is damp with dew, and the scent of fresh earth mingles with the faint fragrance of basil thyme and rosemary. The neatly arranged beds of greenery are all meticulously maintained by the nuns who lived there, women who knew every plant by name and understood its healing properties. You might even see a few herbs sprouting under the shadow of an abbey's tall stone walls, tended to by hands that treated each sprout with reverence and care. In these gardens, the nuns didn't just cultivate plants to eat. They were growing ingredients for tinctures, oils, and potions, many of which were intended for medicinal use. Lavender, chamomile, valerian, and other herbs were cultivated with a singular purpose to heal. The knowledge of these herbs came from ancient texts and the oral traditions passed down from previous generations, but it was also shaped by trial and error. Historians still argue whether the knowledge of herbalism was solely passed down through religious texts, or whether the nuns also learned from folk traditions, which were considered less scholarly, but no less effective. While the Church kept meticulous records of medical knowledge, it wasn't always above borrowing from more earthy traditions that had survived through rural communities. So it's likely that these gardens were a blend of ancient religious practices and the more pagan folk knowledge of healing. Whatever the source, it's clear that the abbey gardens were central to a nun's ability to maintain her health and well-being. In these quiet, sacred spaces, nuns grew the plants that would be brewed into their sleep remedies. In fact, the entire process of growing, harvesting, and preparing these herbs was considered a deeply spiritual act. It wasn't just about physical health. It was about connecting with God's creation, recognizing the divine in the natural world, and using that connection to serve the greater good. The abbey gardens were also a place of solitude, a rare commodity for most nuns who spent their days in prayer and labor alongside their sisters. The act of walking through the garden, tending to the plants, or simply sitting and contemplating the flowers and herbs was a meditative practice. It was a space where they could unwind and slow down, much like we might today, by taking a walk in the park, or enjoying a moment of silence in nature. For the nuns, these gardens offered peace, solace, and most importantly, the opportunity to prepare the very plants that would help them get the rest they needed. But not all of the herbs grown in the abbey gardens were for sleep. Some were used for a variety of other ailments, digestive problems, headaches, and even minor injuries. The nuns' healing skills were well regarded, and many monasteries became known as places where people could come for remedies. While there were no pharmacies, like we have today, the abbey garden functioned as a one-stop shop for everything from cough syrup to pain relief. Many abbeys also sold their products to the local community, creating a symbiotic relationship between the religious and secular worlds. And let's not forget that these gardens weren't always just about healing. Some plants, like rosemary, were used for memory enhancement, and others, like mint and sage, were prized for their ability to clear the mind and improve concentration. For nuns who spent their days reading, writing, and copying sacred texts, a clear and sharp mind was just as important as a good night's sleep. So it's likely that the herb gardens were a place where both body and mind could be restored. Historians still argue whether these gardens were seen primarily as a spiritual practice or as a utilitarian necessity. Were the nuns more focused on the practical applications of their herbs, or was there a deep reverence for the plants as creations of God intended to provide comfort, health, and peace? Some scholars believe that the nuns saw the gardens as a way of honoring their Creator by cultivating and using the plants for healing purposes. Others suggest that much like their use of wine, the herbal remedies were seen as a way to fulfill their earthly duties in the best possible way, while still maintaining their spiritual focus. The gardens were also an expression of the self-sufficiency of medieval monastic life. While the abbey would have had other sources of income, These gardens allowed the nuns to remain somewhat independent, providing the essentials for their health and daily needs. By growing their own herbs, they were able to prepare remedies and medicines without relying on outside sources. The abbey's kitchens, too, would have been stocked with ingredients not just for meals, but for their health-conscious concoctions. The art of making these remedies wasn't something left to chance. It was a learned skill passed down through generations of nuns and monks who saw the value in these natural solutions. But of course, while all of this sounds rather idyllic, peaceful gardens, sacred spaces, herbal remedies, it's important to remember that life in the medieval abbeys wasn't all tranquility and calm. These nuns worked long, exhausting hours, and their days were filled with prayer labor and spiritual discipline. The need for sleep was real, and the effort to get good rest was just as important as the other daily rituals they performed. The garden then wasn't just a place to relax or meditate. It was a vital part of their survival, providing the tools necessary to ensure their physical and mental well-being so they could continue their work. As we continue to explore how medieval nuns navigated the delicate balance between work, prayer, and rest, let's take a closer look at the ways in which these remedies were made and the actual brewing process that allowed the nuns to transform these humble plants into powerful sleep aids. Now that we've explored the abbey herb gardens and the plants that help the nuns rest, let's take a closer look at the fascinating process by which these medicinal herbs were transformed into sleep-inducing concoctions. Imagine for a moment the quiet and precise rituals involved in turning simple plants from the abbey garden into powerful brews, tinctures, and oils. Every step from harvesting the herbs to preparing the remedies required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of the healing properties of nature. First, let's talk about harvesting. The timing of when herbs were gathered was crucial. Nuns weren't just picking leaves and roots on a whim. They knew the exact moments when certain plants were at their peak potency. Some herbs were best harvested in the early morning, while others were picked during the full moon, when the plant's energy was said to be most concentrated. For example, valerian root, one of the nuns' go-to herbs for sleep, was often harvested in late autumn, when the root had absorbed the most energy from the soil. The nuns would typically pick the plants during specific hours of the day, guided by tradition and a sense of spiritual significance. Harvesting these herbs was considered a sacred act, almost like a prayer. Each stem, each leaf, and each flower was treated with reverence, as the nuns carefully plucked them from the earth, mindful of the plant's medicinal purpose. Once collected, the herbs would be carefully dried, either hung up in the abbey kitchen or laid out in the sun to preserve their potency for future use. The drying process was essential because the active compounds in many herbs like valerian and chamomile could degrade if stored improperly. Historians still argue whether this was purely a practical consideration, or if there was a deeper spiritual significance to the timing of harvests. Some scholars believe that the use of these herbs in monastic settings was a way to mirror the divine order of creation. Everything had its time, its place, and its purpose. Others suggest that the nuns were simply following the agricultural knowledge available to them at the time, based on centuries of folk wisdom. Either way, the importance of the harvest process cannot be overstated. It was an integral part of the ritual. Once the herbs were dried, the nuns would begin the next phase of their work preparation. This is where things started to get interesting. the most common way to prepare herbs for medicinal use was to create infusions, which could be consumed as teas or tinctures. Some herbs, like chamomile or lavender, were simple enough to steep in boiling water to make a soothing tea. Others required a bit more finesse. To prepare valerian root, for example, the nuns would often make a tincture by steeping the root in alcohol for several weeks. This method helped extract the root's medicinal properties, concentrating the soothing compounds and making them more potent. But the real magic, of course, came when the nuns decided to combine these herbs with wine. Wine, as we've seen, was a key ingredient in many of the nuns' sleep remedies, and this step often required a bit of alchemy. The process of turning wine into a medicinal drink was not as simple as tossing a few sprigs of lavender into a glass of red. No, it involved a much more methodical approach. Nuns would prepare a base wine, often a light, simple variety, and infuse it with herbs, spices, and sometimes honey. The alcohol in the wine helped extract the medicinal properties of the herbs, creating a potent aromatic drink that could be consumed just before bedtime. Historians still argue whether this kind of herbal wine was seen purely as a medicinal concoction, or whether it also held deeper symbolic meaning for the nuns. Was it just a natural remedy, or did the wine itself carry spiritual significance? After all, wine had long been used in religious rituals as a symbol of communion and divine connection. It's possible that the nuns saw their herbal wines not just as sleep aids, but as part of their spiritual practice, a way to invite peace and calm into their bodies before surrendering to sleep. In some cases, the nuns would add spices like cinnamon cloves or ginger to the wine to enhance both the flavor and the medicinal effects. These spices weren't just for taste. They had their own therapeutic properties, known for their ability to aid digestion, reduce inflammation, and improve circulation. The final product was a warm, comforting drink that could help ease the body into a restful sleep, while also nurturing the spirit. The brewing process was meticulous, but it wasn't the only part of the ritual. Once the wine or tincture was ready, the nuns would typically engage in a quiet time of prayer or reflection. This wasn't just about taking medicine like we do today. It was about creating a moment of peace, a sacred pause before the night. By drinking the herbal wine or tincture, the nuns believed they were not only soothing their bodies, but also aligning themselves with God's natural order. In a way, it was like drinking a sip of divine peace. But while the wine and herbs certainly helped the nuns sleep, they weren't a magical cure-all. Sometimes the nuns needed to go beyond simple herbal remedies to ensure a good night's rest. When sleep was especially elusive, the nuns would sometimes turn to more physical methods of comfort. Some used hot stones or heating pads, placed gently on the body, to soothe tired muscles. Others might have employed more spiritual practices, prayers, quiet meditations, and even the soft chanting of psalms to settle their restless minds before bed. Historians still argue whether these practices were designed to be purely restorative, or whether they were also intended to help the nuns ascend into a more spiritual form of sleep, a sleep that wasn't just for physical rest, but for the rejuvenation of the soul. In a world filled with religious duties and demanding schedules, it's easy to see why sleep was more than just a nightly habit for these nuns. It was a sacred act, part of their spiritual journey. As we've seen, the nuns' methods of preparing sleep remedies were both practical and deeply intertwined with their faith. In the next section, we'll explore how these sleep rituals shaped their social lives and their relationships with the outside world, and how their sleep practices weren't just about rest. They were also a way to cope with the challenges and pressures of monastic life. As we continue to explore the profound impact of sleep on the nuns' lives, it's crucial to understand that their sleep rituals were not isolated from the rest of their existence. In fact, these practices were intricately woven into their social lives, relationships, and even the broader monastic community. Although nuns lived in a cloistered world, cut off from much of secular society, their sleep habits were a form of connection, not just to their inner selves, but to the shared rhythm of monastic life, and even to the outside world in ways they might not have fully realized. In the tightly knit structure of the abbey, sleep rituals were a communal affair. The abbey had a strict schedule that governed not only when the nuns would pray, work, and eat, but also when they would sleep. Despite the natural human need for rest, there was little room for personal choice in the monastic schedule. Sleep was essentially a shared experience. Nuns would retire to their small, Spartan cells at a designated hour, often after evening prayers and meditation. For some, the anticipation of the comforting warmth of their beds, paired with the calming effects of their herbal wines, was a welcome end to a long day of spiritual labor. Yet sleep wasn't just about rest. It was about renewal and divine connection. Even though nuns typically followed the same routine, sleep offered an opportunity for individual reflection and communion with God. Historians still argue whether the shared structure of monastic life allowed for true personal rest, or whether it was simply a matter of conforming to a schedule that emphasized collective needs over individual comfort. In either case, sleep was a sacred space for each nun, an act of trust that through their ritualized rest, they were renewing their spiritual strength to continue their sacred duties. But sleep was not just a retreat from daily labor. It also represented the nuns' relationship to the outside world. The presence of herbal wine prepared in the abbey's kitchens wasn't just a way to drift into a peaceful sleep. It was a subtle interaction with the broader world beyond the abbey walls. The wine, while mostly produced by the nuns themselves, came from grapes that were sometimes sourced from local vineyards. This simple fact connects the nuns to the external world in a way that might surprise us. Despite their cloistered existence, they were still reliant on resources from the outside, creating a bridge between their sacred self-contained life and the society beyond the monastery gates. The wine itself wasn't just a product of the abbey. It was often a reflection of the surrounding community's agricultural and economic systems. In many cases, local farmers, vineyard owners, and even neighboring townspeople played a role in the production of the wine that the nuns would use for their medicinal purposes. This connection is more than just logistical. It's a reminder that while the nuns sought to separate themselves from worldly distractions, they were still part of the larger ecosystem of medieval life. Their sleep remedies, prepared with great care and often crafted with local products, reflected an integration into their environment, albeit in a spiritual, controlled way. Historians still argue whether the nuns saw this exchange with the outside world as an act of necessary survival, or whether they truly viewed it as an opportunity to remain connected to the broader community in a way that didn't compromise their vows. Some scholars suggest that while the nuns might have relied on these outside resources, they did so with a kind of sacred detachment, seeing it as part of their spiritual journey, no different than how a priest might use the fruits of the earth in the service of the church. Others point out that this constant interaction with the outside world must have been difficult for some nuns, who might have felt torn between their desire for seclusion and the practical realities of monastic life. Sleep rituals also had a profound impact on the nuns' social relationships within the abbey. Though life in the cloister was centered around prayer and work, the bond between nuns was often forged during these quiet moments of rest. Shared sleeping quarters, though, rare offered a space for companionship. The mutual experience of shared sleep rituals, herbal remedies, and the collective end-of-day prayer allowed the nuns to maintain their unity and sense of community, even if their physical lives were solitary and marked by silent meditation. The rhythm of their sleep and the rituals that accompanied it helped preserve a bond of sisterhood. This sisterhood, reinforced by the collective experience of their nighttime routines, was essential to the stability and well-being of the monastery. When nuns slept, they often did so in close proximity to one another, with the quiet sounds of breathing and soft rustling of bed sheets, creating a soothing, almost meditative atmosphere. Some historians suggest that this communal experience of sleep, quiet as it was, may have offered the nuns emotional support, a sense of connection that carried them through their more difficult days. But there were also moments when sleep was a personal, private affair. In the solitude of their cells, nuns could retreat from the demands of communal life and take time to reflect, meditate, or even journal. For some, this time in their cells, though, brief was precious. It was in the quiet of their individual sleep practices that they could fully surrender to God, leaving behind the cares and concerns of the world. In these quiet moments, the nuns could rest, knowing that their prayers, their meditations, and their dreams were all part of a larger divine plan. Interestingly, not all nuns were able to sleep as peacefully as we might imagine. For some, the very structure of their monastic life was a source of tension. Life in the abbey was marked by discipline, and that discipline sometimes came at the expense of restful sleep. With prayers, communal duties, and the never-ending labor of maintaining the abbey, some nuns may have found it difficult to truly relax. The constant demands of monastic life, combined with the emotional and spiritual challenges of living in such an isolated, controlled environment, sometimes meant that sleep was hard to come by. For these nuns, the remedies of lavender and valerian might have been more of a necessity than a luxury. Historians still argue whether the difficulty of obtaining proper rest was a widespread issue, or whether it was more of an isolated phenomenon. Some believe that the nuns, faced with the rigorous demands of their vows, often struggled to balance the spiritual, physical, and emotional demands of their lives. Others suggest that the sleep difficulties were relatively minor, given the strong routines and communal support systems in place. Regardless, it's clear that sleep, like everything else in their lives, was a delicate balancing act. As we move forward, we'll explore how these sleep rituals played a role in the broader spiritual and religious practices of medieval life, and how the experience of sleep became a way for nuns to further their understanding of the divine and the afterlife. The role of sleep in the lives of medieval nuns wasn't simply about escaping fatigue or recharging for the day ahead. It was deeply entwined with their spiritual practices and their understanding of the divine. To them, sleep wasn't just a physical need. It was a sacred time, a space where the body could rest, while the soul continued its journey. In fact, sleep was often viewed as an extension of prayer and contemplation, providing the nuns with an opportunity to further deepen their connection to God. But let's take a closer look at how sleep functioned as a spiritual practice in the medieval monastery. In the medieval Christian tradition, sleep wasn't a passive activity. It was thought to be an active state where the soul could engage in divine communication. The idea that sleep was a time for spiritual reflection is rooted in the belief that the soul could leave the body during slumber and ascend to a higher realm, perhaps even experiencing visions or dreams that carried divine messages. Many nuns believed that sleep was a way to purify the soul, much as fasting, prayer, and penance were. This concept of sleep as a time for spiritual renewal is evident in the writings of the time, where nuns described sleep as an offering to God. They believed that as they rested their bodies, their spirits could continue their work of devotion, prayer, and ascetic discipline. Historians still argue whether this view of sleep as a spiritual act was a widespread belief, or whether it was a more personal, mystical interpretation practiced by only a few devout individuals. Some scholars argue that medieval religious texts, particularly those written by mystics and abbey superiors, suggest that sleep was a time for spiritual cleansing and a necessary part of a nun's devotion. Other scholars contend that while the connection between sleep and spiritual renewal may have been idealized, it didn't always reflect the harsh realities of monastic life, where sleep deprivation, stress, and physical exhaustion often interfered with these lofty goals. For nuns who believed in this idea of spiritual renewal through sleep, the act of preparing for sleep was as much a ritual as prayer itself. It wasn't enough to simply go to bed after a long day of work. Instead, sleep was a space to surrender to God, to trust that the divine would provide both physical rest and spiritual clarity. The rituals surrounding sleep, like drinking the herbal wine, were part of this offering. It wasn't just about soothing physical ailments. It was about entering into a state of divine peace. This belief extended to the way the nuns prepared for bed. After evening prayers, nuns would engage in a brief time of reflection or quiet meditation before retiring for the night. This practice of reflection was seen as a way to offer their day to God, surrendering the fruits of their labor and asking for rest in body and spirit. Some nuns wrote in their journals that they viewed the transition from day to night as an opportunity for personal reconciliation, an end to the work of the day, and a renewal of their dedication to God's will. As night fell, the abbey would quiet down. The sound of footsteps echoing through the stone corridors would gradually fade, replaced by the soft rustling of bed linens and the faint murmur of prayers being whispered in the solitude of private cells. It was in these final moments of the day that the nuns would enter into a sort of liminal space, one foot still in the waking world, the other beginning to drift into the mysteries of sleep. In this quiet solitude, many nuns saw sleep as a way to come closer to God, not by physical action, but through spiritual surrender. It was a profound act of faith, a reminder that even in rest, they were still working for God. And in those moments before sleep took hold, some nuns would experience vivid dreams that they often interpreted as spiritual messages or divine guidance. These dreams could be both comforting and alarming, offering a glimpse into what might await them in the afterlife, or providing insight into their current spiritual state. Some believed that their dreams were influenced by the prayers they had recited during the day, or the quiet meditations they had engaged in just before bed. In this sense, sleep wasn't a retreat from the sacred, it was an extension of their spiritual practice, allowing them to continue their journey towards spiritual enlightenment, even while they rested. Historians still argue whether these dreams were genuinely believed to be messages from God, or whether they were merely a psychological byproduct of the intense spiritual practices the nuns engaged in. Some scholars suggest that the intense devotion to prayer and contemplation could have caused nuns to experience vivid dreams as a reflection of their inner thoughts and emotions. Others maintain that medieval society saw dreams as legitimate vehicles for divine communication, something that could offer insight into the mysteries of life and the afterlife. But while the spiritual aspects of sleep were deeply meaningful to many nuns, sleep wasn't always this peaceful or divine. In fact, sleep deprivation was a common problem. The demanding schedule of prayer work and study left little time for rest, and many nuns were chronically fatigued. Sleep disturbances, especially among those who suffered from anxiety or the stresses of monastic life, were not uncommon. The long hours of physical labor, combined with the constant pressure to maintain spiritual discipline, could lead to sleepless nights, even with the aid of herbal remedies. In some cases, sleep was interrupted by the call of the bell for the midnight office, the late-night prayers that nuns were required to attend. This constant interruption of sleep patterns could make the simple act of resting feel like a form of spiritual failure, even if the nuns knew it was out of their control. Historians still argue whether these demands for prayer and vigilance at night were a genuine attempt to foster spiritual growth, or whether they simply reflected the Church's rigid control over the daily lives of its members. What's clear, though, is that the pursuit of rest, even in the form of sleep, was not a straightforward or easy process. As we continue to look at the nuns' sleep practices, we'll see how their unique blend of faith, communal life, and medicinal knowledge intersected with their understanding of the afterlife, influencing the ways they sought rest and renewal through sleep. The pursuit of restful sleep in the medieval abbey was more than a quest for physical rest. It was inextricably linked to the nuns' understanding of life beyond death. As we've seen, sleep was considered a time of spiritual renewal, a pause from earthly duties, and even a bridge to the divine. But what about the afterlife? In medieval Christianity, sleep wasn't just a nightly interlude, it was also a metaphor for death. And this connection between sleep and death was deeply influential in shaping how nuns viewed rest, particularly during times of personal reflection or spiritual struggle. At the heart of the abbey's quietude, the notion of death loomed large. Nuns, who had dedicated their lives to the service of God, saw themselves as living in anticipation of death, not in fear, but in a sense of preparation. Sleep, therefore, was not just a moment of respite from the world, it was a rehearsal for the eternal rest that awaited them. The quiet stillness of the night, the soothing embrace of sleep symbolized the final peace of death, an eventual journey toward eternal rest with God. For many nuns, going to sleep each night was a gentle reminder of their mortality and the afterlife. Historians still argue whether this blending of sleep and death was a literal belief, or more of a metaphorical or theological construct. Some scholars suggest that nuns, particularly those in more mystically inclined orders, may have believed that sleep was a way of dying daily, a preparation for the soul's final departure. Others contend that this connection between sleep and death was not so much a belief, but a theological tool used by the Church to encourage nuns to live each day with a sense of spiritual urgency, reminding them that rest, like life, was fleeting and should be taken seriously. In either case, sleep was seen as a sacred and symbolic act. For many nuns, the prayerful transition from wakefulness to sleep mirrored the process of preparing the soul for its final journey. The rituals surrounding sleep, whether it was the quiet prayers whispered just before resting, the drinking of herbal wine to soothe the body, or the lighting of candles in the darkness, were all part of a larger spiritual practice that invited contemplation on life's transient nature. As they lay down to sleep, nuns were often reminded that this could be the night they might die, a thought that was unsettling, yes, but also a call to be spiritually prepared. The concept of dying daily wasn't unique to medieval nuns. Throughout Christian history, many ascetic orders adopted a similar attitude, seeing the act of sleeping as a moment of surrender to God. This idea was rooted in the ancient Christian tradition of mortification, the practice of denying oneself comforts or desires as a way of drawing closer to God. By embracing sleep as a metaphor for death, nuns sought to free themselves from attachment to worldly things, focusing instead on the eternal rest that would come after death. Their nightly sleep in this view became an act of spiritual purification, a way to turn away from worldly distractions and focus entirely on God. But sleep and death weren't always associated with peaceful resignation. For some nuns, sleep, especially when accompanied by vivid dreams or nightmares, was a source of anxiety. In a world where death was often unpredictable and frequently violent, the thought of passing into the next life wasn't always comforting. Many nuns had to reconcile their deep faith with the uncertainty of what awaited them after death. Sleep could be a time of fear or confusion, particularly for those struggling with spiritual doubt. Dreams, often regarded as spiritual messages, could be deeply unsettling visions of judgment or dark images of hell. These disturbing dreams were believed to be the soul's way of working through its anxieties or sins. In some ways, the nun's spiritual journey could mirror the stages of sleep itself. The transition from wakefulness to slumber, for example, was likened to the soul's journey from earthly life to the afterlife. The process was seen as gradual. Just as sleep was a slow, natural surrender, so too was death. For nuns, each night's rest was an opportunity to practice the art of surrender, of letting go, trusting that God would take care of their soul's transition when the time came. Even the herbal remedies they consumed to aid in sleep were in a way part of this practice of surrender. The herbs were meant to calm and prepare the body for a peaceful rest, symbolizing the peace the soul would ultimately find after death. Historians still argue about how widely nuns embraced this concept of sleep as preparation for death. Some scholars suggest that while it was a commonly held belief among certain monastic orders, other nuns might have viewed sleep more practically as a necessary but mundane part of their day, without the weight of theological reflection. After all, it's not hard to imagine that for some nuns, sleep was simply a necessary escape from the physical exhaustion that came with their rigorous schedules and demanding duties. Yet for others, particularly in the more contemplative orders, sleep was indeed seen as a deeply spiritual act, a connection to both life and death. While sleep had strong connections to death in the minds of many nuns, it was also tied to the broader mystery of the afterlife. Sleep, after all, was considered a temporary death, a little death, as it were, during which the soul could rest and prepare for the eternal rest of heaven. For those nuns who had a mystical view of sleep, it wasn't just about being prepared for the inevitable death of the body. It was also about preparing for the soul's journey to God. They believed that through sleep, their spirits could detach from the distractions of the world and ascend toward divine peace. As we explore how sleep intersected with the nuns' understanding of the afterlife, we'll begin to look at how the rituals and practices they engaged in before and after sleep were designed to ease their passage through both life and death, preparing them for the final journey into the next world. The intricate dance between life, sleep, and death wasn't just a matter of belief for medieval nuns. It was actively reflected in their spiritual and physical practices. As sleep intertwined with the broader mystery of the afterlife, the rituals surrounding it became vital not only for daily rest, but for preparing their souls for what was believed to be their eternal destiny. This preparation involved much more than simply lying down at night. Nuns actively engaged in a range of spiritual and physical activities before, during, and after sleep, ensuring their rest aligned with their deepest spiritual aspirations. One of the most common practices was the compline the final prayer of the day. Before the nuns retired to their cells, they would gather for this solemn service, marking the end of their active day. The compline was essentially a nightly ritual of purification. As they recited prayers and psalms, they sought forgiveness for any sins they may have committed throughout the day, even unknowingly. It was an opportunity to cleanse both body and soul, to enter sleep with a clear conscience. This practice of spiritual purification was also a means of preparing for the metaphorical death, that sleep represented a way to surrender the day's sins, failures, and worldly distractions to God, so they could rest in divine peace. For many nuns, the ritual didn't end with the compline. As part of their spiritual preparation, some would also use the time before sleep to engage in private prayer or meditation. These quiet moments were a final opportunity to reflect on their vows, their relationship with God, and their journey towards spiritual fulfillment. The transition from wakefulness to sleep was seen not as a hard break, but as a soft continuum, an extension of their spiritual devotion. To fall asleep without offering these final prayers was to neglect an essential part of their spiritual journey. Historians still argue whether these pre-sleep rituals were as universally practiced as they seem in monastic records. While the tradition of the compline and the ritual of nightly prayer were certainly common across many monastic orders, some nuns may have found this practice burdensome, especially considering the exhaustion they experienced due to their rigorous daily schedules. In fact, some scholars suggest that certain nuns, particularly those in more active orders, might have seen these rituals as too demanding after a long day of physical labor. For them, sleep was primarily a form of recuperation, not something that required deep spiritual reflection. But for many contemplative nuns, these nightly prayers were just as vital as the physical act of sleep itself. The quietude of their cells, the gentle whisper of their prayers, and the serenity of the night allowed them to enter a deeper spiritual state, one that transcended their physical exhaustion. This state of grace, they believed, would carry them into sleep and beyond, into the waiting arms of God. In addition to the rituals of prayer, nuns also relied on various physical aids to prepare themselves for sleep. One of the most important of these was the use of herbal remedies, like the wine and teas we've discussed earlier. The medicinal use of herbs in monastic life wasn't limited to just promoting rest. Many of these plants were also thought to have spiritual properties. For example, lavender, a popular herb used for its calming effects, was also associated with purity and protection. In the context of sleep, it was believed that drinking a lavender-infused wine or tea could not only help ease the body into rest, but also protect the soul during its nightly journey. Historians still argue whether nuns truly believed in the spiritual power of these herbs, or if their use was more about managing physical discomfort and promoting a restful night. Some scholars suggest that the belief in the spiritual properties of these herbs was widespread, deeply embedded in the broader medieval worldview that saw nature as imbued with divine significance. Others point out that the medicinal qualities of the herbs were well documented, and it's possible that nuns saw their use more as a practical remedy for physical ailments than as part of their spiritual practice. Regardless of their beliefs, the fact remains that these herbs played an important role in the nuns' daily lives. They didn't just help ease the body into sleep. They also offered a comforting ritualistic experience. The act of preparing the herbal remedy, perhaps in the abbey's communal kitchen, where the herbs were grown in the abbey garden, was itself a ritual. For many nuns, this process was both practical and spiritual. The blending of herbs was seen as a symbol of their daily surrender to God, a way of offering up their earthly needs to a higher power. Moreover, the act of drinking a cup of wine or tea was a moment of stillness, a chance to focus on the present and quiet the mind before sleep. It was a time to pause, reflect, and reconnect with the divine before surrendering to rest. The calming effects of the wine weren't just about physical relaxation. They were a way to promote spiritual serenity as well. The soft glow of candlelight in the nuns' cells, combined with the fragrance of the herbs, set the mood for an evening of quiet reflection, a transition from the noise and busyness of the day to the silent embrace of sleep. But even with these rituals in place, sleep was not always a peaceful experience for the nuns. The stress of daily life, whether from the physical demands of their work, the emotional weight of their vows, or the spiritual struggles they encountered, often interrupted their attempts at rest. Some nuns, particularly those with more contemplative or mystical inclinations, found that sleep brought not only physical rest, but also intense spiritual experiences, such as visions, dreams, or mystical encounters. These experiences could be deeply disorienting, sometimes providing both solace and fear. Historians still argue whether these dreams and visions were a manifestation of the nuns' intense spiritual practices, or whether they were psychological byproducts of sleep deprivation. Some scholars believe that the intense prayer and fasting nuns engaged in could trigger altered states of consciousness, leading to vivid dreams or hallucinations. Others argue that these dreams were not merely the result of physical exhaustion, but rather divine messages that helped the nuns in their spiritual journey, offering insight into their relationship with God. For the most devout nuns, dreams were seen as a form of spiritual communication. The nuns would often record their dreams in journals, interpreting them as divine revelations. Some would seek guidance from the abbey's spiritual advisors, who could offer interpretation based on Christian teachings. Visions of angels' heavenly realms, or even encounters with Christ, were not uncommon among nuns who followed more mystical practices. These dreams were considered not just as experiences of the subconscious, but as important spiritual events that could help nuns better understand their divine calling. In this way, sleep was not just about rest. It was about deepening their connection to the divine, sometimes through the mystical experiences that occurred while they slept. The quietude of sleep was, after all, a space where the soul was free to wander, to seek communion with God in a way that wasn't always possible during waking hours. In our next section, we'll look at how these spiritual practices of sleep and rest influenced the broader religious and societal perspectives of the time, and how the unique blend of religious devotion, physical care, and psychological experiences created a sleep culture like no other. The blending of spiritual devotion and physical care that marked the sleep culture of medieval nuns wasn't just a personal practice. It had broader implications for both their monastic communities and society at large. The concept of sleep as both a divine and restorative activity, alongside the rituals and medicinal practices that supported it, made the abbey a unique hub of sleep culture. The way nuns prepared for sleep, the remedies they used, and the spiritual significance they attached to rest were a reflection of the medieval worldview, one that deeply intertwined physical health, emotional well-being, and spiritual life. This view didn't just stay within the walls of the abbey either. It gradually influenced how the wider medieval society approached sleep and health. Take, for example, the growing belief in the therapeutic value of herbal remedies, which nuns had long practiced. Over time, the medicinal knowledge contained in monastic texts, much of it focused on herbs used to ease sleep, would trickle into the wider public consciousness. Many of the herbs nuns used to prepare their sleep aids, such as valerian chamomile and lavender, became staples in early medieval folk medicine. Nuns, with their meticulous understanding of plants, were the original herbalists of their time, passing on their knowledge to the broader population. By the end of the medieval period, some of these plants were well known in secular medical practice, marking the beginning of a more widespread acceptance of herbal medicine. But while the knowledge of sleep-promoting herbs spread, it wasn't just the physical remedies that had a cultural impact. The spiritual rituals surrounding sleep, especially the belief that sleep could be an extension of prayer and a preparation for death, were also influential. For many medieval people, the line between waking and sleeping wasn't as rigid as it is today. Sleep was viewed not as a passive state, but as a continuation of the soul's work, a belief that gradually seeped into the broader Christian world. The monastic model of sleep as an active, prayerful time was not confined to the abbey. Eventually, religious leaders and even some secular figures began to incorporate spiritual reflection before sleep into their own lives. People who followed the medieval Christian tradition often prayed before bed, not just to ask for divine protection, but to ensure their souls remained in a state of readiness for the afterlife. Historians still argue whether this spiritual view of sleep was universally adopted by the population, or if it remained largely within monastic circles. Some scholars suggest that the idea of sleep as a spiritual preparation for death, or a continuation of the soul's work, was a deeply ingrained part of Christian practice, especially among the more devout. Other scholars counter that the practical and restorative aspects of sleep, much like modern-day attitudes, probably outweighed the spiritual considerations for most people. After all, it was likely much easier for the average medieval person to think of sleep as a necessary earthly break rather than a spiritual event with afterlife implications. Whatever the case, the medieval culture surrounding sleep was undeniably tied to both body and soul. One of the ways this connection manifested was in the growing interest in sleep disorders and the remedies used to address them. The medieval period was not without its share of sleep-related problems, such as insomnia nightmares or disturbed dreams. And just as nuns turned to herbal remedies to help them sleep, others in society sought out solutions to their sleep problems as well. Some turned to prayers or charms, hoping to protect themselves from bad dreams, while others relied on the burgeoning field of folk medicine to find relief. The treatment of sleep disorders in the medieval world, however, was far more than just medicinal. It was also spiritual. People who struggled with sleep often saw their sleeplessness as a sign of spiritual imbalance, a failure to properly surrender to God. Nightmares in particular were believed to be caused by demonic interference, or more commonly, by one's own internal sins or spiritual failings. In fact, many medieval medical texts suggested that the cure for insomnia wasn't simply about taking herbs or adopting good sleep hygiene. It was about purification, repenting for sins, confessing to a priest, and offering prayers of atonement. If one couldn't sleep, it was assumed that there was a deeper spiritual reason for it. At the same time, the medical and religious authorities of the time also acknowledged that some people's inability to sleep could be caused by more earthly issues, illness stress, or even the sheer physical exhaustion brought on by long hours of labor. This was particularly true for peasants and lower-class folk, who often had to work hard in the fields or in other physically demanding jobs. Sleep deprivation, particularly among the working class, was a well-documented issue, with some medieval texts even describing people who were so overworked that they simply couldn't find rest, no matter how hard they tried. The Church, with its strict codes of conduct, often added its own moral spin to these issues, suggesting that those who suffered from insomnia may have been in need of spiritual reflection or more prayer to realign their souls with divine order. Historians still debate how these overlapping ideas of spiritual and physical sleep troubles played out in daily medieval life. Some believe that the Church's emphasis on the soul's responsibility for physical problems could have led to unnecessary guilt or shame for people experiencing sleep disorders. Others contend that the widespread use of sleep-inducing remedies, like those mentioned earlier, shows a more practical side to medieval approaches to sleep, one that was less concerned with spiritual purity and more focused on simply helping people get the rest they needed. Ultimately, it's likely that medieval society saw sleep as a multifaceted issue, one that blended physical, psychological, and spiritual factors. The influence of the abbey's sleep culture can also be seen in the broader development of monastic architecture. Monasteries were specifically designed to foster an environment conducive to spiritual work, and that included sleep. The architecture of the abbey itself, from the size and layout of cells to the communal spaces where nuns gathered for prayer, was all geared toward creating a peaceful and meditative space for the nuns. The goal was to provide an atmosphere that encouraged both physical rest and spiritual rejuvenation. This thoughtful design had a far-reaching impact on the construction of religious and secular buildings in the medieval period, setting the stage for future architectural trends that emphasized quietude and serenity, which would eventually influence the development of hospitals, universities, and other communal spaces. As we move into the final section of our story, we'll reflect on how all of these rituals, beliefs, and practices surrounding sleep not only shaped the lives of nuns, but also created a lasting legacy that influenced the way future generations approached rest health and spirituality. By the time we reach the late medieval period, the intersection of sleep spirituality and health had become a complex, almost mystical web of practices and beliefs that reached far beyond the abbey walls. The monastic way of life, especially when it came to rest, would influence not only the religious communities, but also the secular world, as elements of the medieval sleep culture trickled into daily life. Many of the habits, remedies, and prayers nuns practiced at night would set the groundwork for broader societal trends in health, wellness, and spirituality, which would carry on into the Renaissance and beyond. The transition from a deeply spiritual understanding of sleep to a more secular and scientific perspective wasn't abrupt. Instead, it was shaped by centuries of careful reflection, study, and adaptation. As we look at the legacy of medieval sleep practices, it's important to note that while the monastic emphasis on rest as a spiritual exercise faded over time, the foundational ideas that sleep could be part of a holistic approach to well-being persisted. The medicinal use of herbs for promoting restful sleep, which nuns had mastered, evolved into the beginnings of modern herbalism. The specific remedies used, such as valerian root lavender and chamomile, would become staples in later folk medicine, and eventually be adopted into the more formalized medical practices of the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. Even today, these same herbs are commonly used to treat insomnia, anxiety, and other sleep disorders. But beyond the physical remedies, the spiritual implications of sleep would also leave their mark on Christian practices in the centuries to come. While sleep was once seen as an extension of prayer and a moment for divine connection over time, the focus shifted to the need for rest and rejuvenation for one's physical body. The idea that sleep could prepare the soul for its eventual journey into the afterlife was gradually overshadowed by a more materialistic scientific approach to sleep. The Enlightenment brought with it an emphasis on reason, and as such, sleep became increasingly regarded as a purely physiological function, one that was important for maintaining health, but not necessarily tied to spiritual matters. Historians still argue whether the decline in spiritual perspectives on sleep was a direct consequence of the rise of scientific thinking, or if it simply marked a natural evolution in how human beings approached rest. Some suggest that as the medieval world became more centered around empirical observation, and the scientific method sleep naturally shifted from being a spiritual experience to a biological one. Others believe that this shift was more gradual, with the theological interpretations of sleep remaining relevant even during the early phases of modernity. Either way, the legacy of medieval sleep practices, particularly in how rest was understood as essential to both physical and spiritual health, remains influential today. In addition to the practical and medicinal effects of medieval sleep practices, there's also a certain poetic beauty in how sleep was viewed during this time. For the nuns, sleep was not just about escaping the pressures of daily life. It was a deeply sacred act, an act of surrendering to God, a preparation for death, and a reflection on life's transience. This perspective is perhaps lost in the modern world, where sleep is often seen more as an obstacle to productivity or a necessity for maintaining one's daily routine. The idea of sleep as a sacred act of devotion and rest seems distant in a world where the urgency of modern life often trumps the slower, quieter rhythms of the past. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, there's still a kind of magic that remains a sense that sleep holds more than just biological significance. We still speak of sleep as a time for recharging, though few of us actively connect that need for rest to our spiritual well-being. For nuns, sleep was a means of renewal, a way of turning away from the world, for a time both physically and spiritually. The rituals that helped prepare their bodies and minds for sleep, from prayer to herbal remedies, were an essential part of their spiritual practice. It was an acknowledgement that the body, like the soul, needed care and attention. Today, while we may not pray or drink herbal wine before bed, many of us still carry on a ritualistic connection to our sleep routines. Whether it's a cup of chamomile tea, the soft light of a bedside candle, or even the quiet reflection at the end of the day, these small rituals show that even in our modern secular world, the intersection between body, mind, and sleep still carries deep significance. Perhaps in the quiet moments before we drift off, we are in some small way continuing a tradition that spans centuries, a tradition in which rest is as much a spiritual act as a physical one. Historians still argue whether these modern rituals are consciously influenced by the medieval sleep culture, or if they are simply the result of a shared human need for ritual and calm before sleep. Some scholars suggest that modern sleep practices, especially in terms of creating a peaceful environment, are a direct continuation of medieval practices, albeit without the theological overtones. Others argue that the desire for restful sleep transcends historical periods and is rooted in universal human needs. Either way, the medieval nuns' approach to rest laid the groundwork for the ways we think about and care for our sleep today. As we wind down from this long exploration of medieval nuns and their unique relationship with sleep, it's clear that what they understood as the intersection of rest, health, and spirituality has a lasting impact that we still feel today. From herbal remedies to quiet reflections, from communal prayer to the personal act of surrendering to rest-sleep, was far from ordinary for these women. It was an act of faith, a practice of peace, and a preparation for life's ultimate journey. In our next section, we'll slow things down and reflect on how the spiritual dimensions of sleep continue to shape our lives today, reminding us that there is still sacredness in the act of rest. In the busy modern world, we might just need it more than we realize. As we close in on the final chapters of this journey, let's take a step back and reflect on how medieval nuns' approaches to sleep-blending spirituality with physical rest can still resonate in our lives today. In a world that often prizes hustle and productivity, it's easy to forget the ancient sacred practices surrounding sleep. But even now, in the midst of endless to-do lists and bright screens, we still find ourselves searching for ways to wind down and prepare for rest, often returning to elements that echo the rituals of centuries past. The most obvious legacy of the medieval nuns' sleep practices lies in the quiet rituals many of us incorporate into our evening routines. Whether it's a cup of calming tea, a few minutes of meditation, or the soft flicker of a candle before bed, we continue to ritualize the transition from wakefulness to sleep. These modern practices may not have the theological weight of medieval prayers or the specific medicinal properties of their herbal wines, but they carry a sense of reverence for sleep, an understanding that rest is not simply an interruption of our busy lives, but an essential and sacred pause. Even the simple act of shutting down for the night, of turning away from the screen and the distractions of the day, has echoes of the medieval nuns' process of purification before rest. Their rituals, whether through prayer reflection or the preparation of herbal remedies, were about cleansing the mind, body, and spirit before entering a state of rest. Today, many of us engage in something akin to this, perhaps unknowingly. The way we dim the lights, put away our devices, and create a space of peace before sleep could be seen as a continuation of the medieval practice of preparing for rest in a mindful and intentional way. Historians still argue whether the modern sleep culture that prioritizes relaxation rituals is a return to ancient practices or simply a natural progression of our understanding of rest. Some argue that the modern obsession with sleep hygiene, which focuses on preparing both body and mind for sleep, is a direct descendant of these ancient monastic practices. Others suggest that our contemporary understanding of sleep as a health priority is more rooted in the rise of psychology and sleep science than in spiritual tradition. Regardless of its origins, it's clear that, like the medieval nuns, we have an innate understanding that sleep is not a passive event. It's something we must actively nurture, whether through ritual environment or even the foods and drinks we consume. The use of herbal remedies, which were so central to the medieval nuns' sleep preparation, has also found a place in modern culture. While we may not be sipping herbal wine, many people today turn to natural remedies like chamomile tea, valerian root, and lavender essential oils to help them wind down at night. These ancient herbs, used for centuries by nuns to ease the body into restful slumber, are still part of our nightly rituals. Whether through teas, oils, or pillow sprays, these simple herbal traditions endure, showing that some ancient wisdom has endured the test of time. The very act of entering sleep as a spiritual experience has also resurfaced in different forms. While most modern people no longer see sleep as a preparation for death or a necessary purification before entering the afterlife, many of us still look to our dreams for meaning and insight. The dream journals that nuns kept recording their nightly visions and interpreting them through a spiritual lens have evolved into the modern practice of dream analysis. The difference now is that we look at dreams through a psychological or personal growth perspective, but there's still that lingering sense that sleep, whether it's the act of resting or the experiences that unfold in the night, holds more significance than just a biological function. Some psychologists even argue that dreams are as much about spiritual well-being as they are about mental health. In fact, many therapeutic approaches today, such as those in mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy, emphasize the importance of resting both the body and mind. The practice of quiet reflection before sleep, as medieval nuns would have done, can still be found in modern therapeutic techniques, which encourage individuals to pause, reflect, and mentally release the tensions of the day before bed. The more we learn about the brain, the more we understand that the state of mind before sleep can significantly impact the quality of our rest, and by extension, our overall well-being. In this way, sleep continues to be a deeply sacred practice, not in the sense of religious devotion, but as an acknowledgement of our need for balance. The message the medieval nuns left us isn't that we should mimic their exact practices, but that we should pay attention to the deeper purpose of rest. We might not need to pray over a glass of wine or meditate on our sins before sleeping, but we can still honor sleep as a necessary rejuvenating pause from the demands of our busy, sometimes overwhelming lives. So as we drift toward the end of tonight's exploration, let's take a moment to reflect on how sleep fits into our modern world. In the rush to get things done, we often forget that rest is just as crucial for our physical, emotional, and mental health as any work or productivity. And maybe, just maybe, taking a little inspiration from those medieval nuns might help us bring back a bit of sacredness into our own sleep rituals. As you tuck yourself into bed tonight, or even just lie down and close your eyes, consider this sleep is a time for surrender. It's an opportunity to cleanse, to rest, and to renew not just physically, but spiritually. The nuns of the medieval world knew this well. They knew that the act of sleep was far from passive. It was an essential part of a larger cycle of renewal, healing, and divine connection. Perhaps it's time for all of us to remember this. As we reach the final stretch of this journey, it's time to slow things down and bring this exploration of medieval sleep culture to a soft, peaceful close. We've wandered through the halls of abbeys, into the gardens where nuns cultivated their sleep-inducing herbs, and into the quiet moments before sleep, where spirituality and rest converged in ways that still echo through time. But now, it's time to take a breath, exhale and let go. The rituals of sleep, as practiced by medieval nuns, were about much more than just the act of resting. They were about embracing stillness, about taking the time to acknowledge that sleep wasn't a mere interruption of the day, but a sacred pause. The nuns understood something deeply profound about sleep, something we often overlook in the modern world, that rest is necessary for the soul. We need time to disconnect, to replenish, and to prepare for what lies ahead. Even if our modern lives are far removed from the abbeys of old, there's something remarkably timeless in the way we approach our own rituals of rest. In the quiet moments before you drift off to sleep, just as the medieval nuns once did, there's an invitation to surrender. Let go of the thoughts and worries that weigh you down. In a way, this is still the quiet preparation, the cleansing for the night ahead, much like they did with their prayers and potions, though we may not turn to herbal wine or recite prayers in the same way. The act of slowing down, of dimming the lights, of easing into the silence, is itself a small, quiet act of reverence. Historians still debate whether the deep spiritual connection to sleep, as practiced by the nuns, is something we've lost in today's world, or if it's merely changed form. Some argue that we've traded one form of reverence for another. After all, our search for sleep rituals, whether through relaxation techniques, sleep meditations, or simply a warm cup of tea, shows that we haven't entirely abandoned the sacredness of rest. Others suggest that the true spirit of sleep, what the nuns believed to be a bridge between life and the afterlife, has faded into the background, overtaken by the modern rush for efficiency and productivity. But maybe that's the beauty of it. While we may not practice sleep as a direct preparation for death, we still understand that rest is crucial. We still seek out ways to improve the quality of our sleep, because deep down, we know that rest is not just about restoring energy. It's about restoring balance and sometimes even our spirit. As you lie there, whether in your own bed or wherever you happen to be, take a moment to think about how the very act of sleep connects you to something much bigger than just your own body. It's a time when the mind quiets, when the physical world fades away, and when just for a moment you're given the chance to rest, reflect, and renew. The medieval nuns did it, and we do it too, just in our own way. So as we gently drift away from this history, think of the nuns who in their own unique way created a kind of peace through their rituals of sleep peace that still finds its way to us even in this modern age. The herbs, the prayers, the quiet rituals before bed, they were all designed to help them rest their bodies and spirits in the most peaceful, restful way possible. And maybe there's a bit of that ancient wisdom we can carry with us as we head into our own peaceful night. As you prepare for sleep, consider the quiet legacy of the nuns. Let their peaceful, sacred approach to rest remind you that sleep is more than just a biological necessity. It's a moment of calm in an often chaotic world. It's a chance to let go of everything, to simply rest, and to reconnect with the quiet part of you that exists beyond the noise of the day. Now, as you prepare to settle in, let the weight of your body sink into your bed, and let your mind ease into the silence. In this peaceful moment, may you find rest, not just for your body, but for your soul, just as those nuns once did.